Have you ever helped someone who had absolutely nothing, knowing you might never see them again? What if that one act of kindness came back 20 years later in the most unexpected way? Caleb stood at the doorway, rain soaking through his torn jacket, his small frame trembling as he knocked one more time. The wooden door of the small bakery creaked open, and there she was, Vera Coleman, flour dusting her tired hands, her eyes meeting those of a 13-year-old boy who looked like he hadn't eaten in days. Behind him, the storm raged, lightning illuminating the empty streets of Millbrook, a town so small that everyone knew everyone's business. Caleb's lips quivered as he whispered words that would change both their lives forever. "Please. I'll pay you back when I'm rich. I promise." But Vera had no idea that this soaking wet, starving boy would one day return to keep that promise in a way that would shake the entire town. Before we continue, if this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us share more incredible stories like this one. Now, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Let's begin. 3 days earlier, Caleb's world had shattered into a million pieces. The funeral had been quick, attended by only a handful of people who barely knew his parents. His father, Jonah, had worked at the lumber mill on the edge of town. His mother, Naomi, had cleaned houses for the wealthier families on Oak Street. They weren't rich, but they had love, and for Caleb that had been enough. Then came the accident, a truck losing control on the rain-slicked highway, taking both his parents in an instant. No relatives came forward. No aunts, no uncles, no grandparents. Caleb was alone in a world that suddenly felt impossibly large and terrifyingly cold. The first night after the funeral, he slept on a bench outside the town library. The second night, he tried the park, but the older boys who hung around there chased him away, laughing at his ragged clothes and dirty face. By the third day, hunger gnawed at his stomach like a wild animal. He hadn't eaten since the morning of the funeral when Mrs. Patterson from next door had brought over a casserole she never actually gave him. She'd left it on the porch, and by the time Caleb found it, the neighborhood dogs had gotten to it first. That's when he found himself standing outside Coleman's bakery. The smell of fresh bread had drawn him like a magnet. He'd walked past this shop 1,000 times with his mother, always admiring the golden loaves and sweet pastries in the window but never able to afford them. Now, with rain beginning to fall and darkness creeping in, Caleb made a decision born of pure desperation. He would ask for help. Vera Coleman was 53 years old, a widow who'd lost her husband Silas to cancer 7 years prior. She lived above the bakery in a small 2-room apartment that smelled perpetually of cinnamon and yeast. She had no children of her own, a fact that the town gossips loved to whisper about, as if her worth as a woman was diminished by it. But Vera had learned long ago to tune out the noise. She worked 16-hour days, kneading dough before sunrise and cleaning ovens long after sunset. The bakery was her life, her purpose, her sanctuary. When she opened the door that rainy evening and saw Caleb standing there, soaked to the bone, she recognized him immediately. She'd seen him around town, always polite, always holding his mother's hand at the grocery store. She'd heard about the accident, heard the whispers that no one had claimed the boy, that he'd probably end up in the state system, shipped off to some facility 2 counties over. "Please," Caleb said again, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I haven't eaten in 3 days. I don't have any money, but I promise, when I grow up and get rich, I'll pay you back every penny. I swear it." Something in Vera's chest cracked open. Maybe it was the way his dark eyes held on to hope even as his body shook with cold. Maybe it was the memory of her own childhood, growing up poor in the mountains of West Virginia, knowing what it felt like to be hungry and forgotten. Or maybe it was simply that she recognized something pure in this boy, something worth saving. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. Caleb hesitated, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then, slowly, he stepped over the threshold into the warm, golden light of the bakery. The smell hit him immediately: bread, butter, sugar, vanilla, and his knees almost buckled. Vera guided him to a small table in the back corner, near the ovens where the heat was strongest. "Sit," she commanded gently. "Don't move." She disappeared into the kitchen and returned moments later with a plate piled high, thick slices of sourdough bread still warm from the afternoon bake, a bowl of vegetable soup she'd made for her own dinner, a glass of milk, and 2 chocolate chip cookies. Caleb stared at the food as if it were a mirage that might vanish if he blinked. "Eat slowly," Vera warned. "Your stomach's empty. Too fast and you'll get sick." But Caleb couldn't help himself. He devoured the bread in huge bites, tears streaming down his face as he ate. The soup disappeared in minutes. The cookies vanished before Vera could sit down. When he finally finished, he looked up at her with gratitude so intense it was almost painful to witness. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you so much. Vera nodded, her own eyes glistening. Where are you staying tonight? Caleb's face fell. I don't know. Maybe the park or... Absolutely not, Vera cut him off. You'll stay here. Upstairs. I have a couch. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. I can't, Caleb started. You can and you will, Vera said firmly. Now come on. Let's get you cleaned up. That night, as Caleb lay on Vera's worn but comfortable couch, wrapped in blankets that smelled like lavender, he made a silent vow. Someday, somehow, he would repay this woman. He would become someone important, someone successful, and he would come back to this little bakery and give Vera Coleman everything she deserved. The next morning, the town began to talk. Millbrook was the kind of place where secrets lasted about as long as fresh milk in summer heat. By noon, everyone knew that Vera Coleman had taken in the orphan boy. And not everyone was happy about it. She's crazy, Beatrice Morrison announced at the hair salon, her voice carrying over the hum of hair dryers. That boy's trouble. Mark my words, he'll rob her blind and disappear. She can barely afford to feed herself, added Dorothy Hughes, the pharmacist's wife. Now she's taking in strays? What's next? Opening a homeless shelter. Even Reverend Paul Matthews, who preached about charity every Sunday, pulled Vera aside after church that week. I admire your compassion, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. But you need to think practically. The boy should go to social services. They have programs, facilities. You're not equipped to raise a child. Vera listened to them all with a calm smile that never reached her eyes. Then she went back to the bakery, back to Caleb, and ignored every single word. The weeks turned into months. Caleb proved himself to be nothing like the town predicted. He woke up at 4:30 every morning right alongside Vera and helped with the baking. His hands were small, but they learned quickly how to knead dough without overworking it, how to shape rolls with just the right tension, how to tell when bread was perfectly baked by the sound it made when you tapped the bottom. He swept floors, washed dishes, served customers with a politeness that won over even the harshest critics. He also went to school. Millbrook Elementary was a 15-minute walk from the bakery, and Caleb never missed a day. His teachers noticed something special about him immediately, a hunger for knowledge that matched his earlier hunger for food. He devoured books the way he devoured that first meal, staying up late into the night reading under the dim lamp in Vera's living room. But life wasn't easy. The other kids could be cruel. They mocked his second-hand clothes, the ones Vera bought from the church donation box. They whispered about how he lived above a bakery with a woman who wasn't even his real family. During lunch, when other kids traded snacks and shared treats from home, Caleb sat alone with the simple sandwich Vera packed for him, pretending not to notice the stares. One afternoon in late October, 3 boys from his grade cornered him behind the school gym. The leader was Garrett Fisher, the mayor's son, a stocky kid with mean eyes and a sense of entitlement that came from never being told no. Hey, orphan boy, Garrett sneered. I heard you're working at the bakery like some kind of servant. Does the old lady make you sleep in the oven? His friends laughed, ugly sounds that echoed off the brick walls. Caleb kept his eyes down, trying to walk past them, but Garrett shoved him hard. Caleb stumbled, his books scattering across the pavement. What's the matter? Garrett taunted. Gonna cry? Gonna run home to your fake mom? Something inside Caleb snapped. He wasn't a fighter, had never thrown a punch in his life, but fury and pain and months of bottled-up grief exploded out of him. He launched himself at Garrett, fists swinging wildly. They crashed to the ground, rolling and punching until a teacher pulled them apart. Both boys ended up in Principal Carson's office. Garrett, with a bloody nose and torn shirt, spun an elaborate lie about how Caleb had attacked him for no reason. Caleb sat silently, knowing that no matter what he said, no one would believe the orphan over the mayor's son. Principal Carson suspended Caleb for 3 days. When Vera heard what happened, she didn't yell. She didn't lecture. She simply sat Caleb down at the small kitchen table upstairs and said, "Tell me what really happened." And Caleb did. He told her everything, the mockery, the isolation, the constant reminder that he didn't belong. When he finished, tears were streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I know fighting is wrong. I know I messed up. If you want me to leave." "Stop," Vera said, her voice gentle but firm. She reached across the table and took his hands in hers. "You're not going anywhere. You hear me? This is your home. I'm not your mother, Caleb, but I'm here and I'm not leaving you. Ever." Those words became Caleb's anchor. In a world that seemed determined to wash him away, Vera Coleman was his rock. And his promise to her, that someday he would pay her back when he was rich, burned brighter in his heart with each passing day. Years moved forward like pages in a book. Caleb grew taller, his voice deepened, his mind sharpened. By high school he was at the top of his class, taking every advanced course Millbrook High School offered. He worked mornings and evenings at the bakery, saving every dollar he could. Vera insisted he keep most of his earnings for college, but Caleb always found ways to contribute, fixing the broken oven himself instead of calling a repairman, negotiating better prices with suppliers, creating new recipes that brought in customers from neighboring towns. The townspeople's opinions slowly shifted. They saw how hard Caleb worked, how respectfully he treated Vera, how he never complained despite having every reason to be bitter. Some even began to admire Vera for what she'd done, though they'd never admit they'd been wrong to doubt her. But not everyone changed their minds. Garrett Fisher and his cronies continued their torment, though it became more psychological than physical as they got older. They spread rumors, vandalized Caleb's locker, made sure he was excluded from parties and social events. Caleb learned to build walls around himself, to focus on his goals rather than his loneliness. Then came senior year, and with it, the biggest opportunity of Caleb's life. His chemistry teacher, Mr. Levi Grant, pulled him aside after class one December afternoon. "Caleb," he said, handing him a thick envelope, "this is an application for the Whitmore Scholarship. Full ride to any university in the country, plus a living stipend. It's incredibly competitive, they only award one per state, but if anyone can get it, it's you." Caleb stared at the envelope as if it contained magic. "Why me?" Mr. Grant smiled. "Because you're brilliant, hardworking, and you've overcome more than most people face in a lifetime. You deserve this shot. Take it." That night, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with Vera, the application spread out before them. It asked for essays, recommendations, proof of financial need, a detailed plan for how the scholarship would be used. It was overwhelming, but Vera's steady presence kept him grounded. "You can do this," she said simply. "Write from your heart. Tell them your truth." Caleb worked on that application for 3 months. He wrote about losing his parents, about hunger and homelessness, about the woman who saved him when the world turned its back. He wrote about his dreams of becoming a doctor, of returning to small towns like Millbrook and providing health care to people who couldn't afford it. He poured every ounce of his soul onto those pages. In April the letter arrived. Caleb's hands shook as he opened the envelope in front of Vera. His eyes scanned the first line once, twice, 3 times before the words finally sank in. "Dear Mr. Caleb Jensen, congratulations." He'd won. Full scholarship to Princeton University. All expenses paid. Vera screamed, actually screamed, with joy. She grabbed Caleb and pulled him into a fierce hug, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. It was the happiest moment of Caleb's life since before his parents died. But that happiness was tinged with something else: fear. Fear of leaving Vera alone. Fear of abandoning the only person who'd ever truly cared for him. "What about the bakery?" he asked that night. "What about you? I can't just leave." "Yes, you can and you will," Vera interrupted, her voice brooking no argument. "This is your chance, Caleb. This is everything we've worked for. I'll be fine. The bakery will be fine. You go out there and become everything you're meant to be." "I'll pay you back," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I said it when I was 13 and maybe you thought it was just a kid talking, but I meant it then and I mean it now. When I'm successful, when I'm rich, I'm coming back here and I'm going to—" "Hush," Vera said, placing a gentle hand on his cheek. "You don't owe me anything. You've already given me more than you know. You've given me purpose. You've given me a reason to keep going. That's worth more than all the money in the world." But Caleb shook his head. "A promise is a promise. And I never break my promises." The summer before college was bittersweet. Caleb worked longer hours at the bakery, trying to build up inventory and create systems that would help Vera manage alone. He taught her how to use the new computerized accounting system he'd set up, organized the storage room, even painted the exterior of the shop to make it look fresh and inviting. On his last night in Millbrook, Vera threw him a small party. Just the two of them, a homemade cake with "Congratulations Caleb" written in blue icing, and a gift wrapped in newspaper because Vera had never been one for fancy wrapping paper. Inside was a watch. Not expensive, but sturdy and reliable, with an inscription on the back: "Time flies but promises last forever. VC." Caleb clutched that watch like a lifeline. "I won't forget," he whispered. "I promise I won't forget." The next morning, Vera drove him to the bus station in her ancient pickup truck. They didn't talk much during the ride. Everything that needed to be said had been said. At the station, as Caleb's bus idled nearby, he turned to Vera one last time. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for everything he felt. "For everything. For saving my life. For believing in me when no one else did. For being—" He couldn't finish. Vera pulled him into one last hug, her small frame surprisingly strong. "Go change the world," she whispered into his shoulder. "And don't look back." But as the bus pulled away, Caleb did look back. He watched through the rear window as Vera stood in the parking lot, one hand raised in farewell, getting smaller and smaller until she was just a dot, and then nothing at all. He touched the watch on his wrist and made his promise one more time, silently but with absolute conviction. "I will come back. And I will repay you for everything." What Caleb didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know as that bus carried him toward his future, was that 20 years later that promise would be tested in ways he never imagined. That Vera Coleman, the woman who saved his life, would face a crisis so devastating that it would take everything Caleb had become to save her in return. And that when he finally did return to Millbrook, the entire town would witness what happens when a promise made by a desperate boy becomes the mission of a powerful man. But that part of the story was still years away, waiting in the future like a storm gathering on the horizon. For now, Caleb had a world to conquer, mountains to climb, and a promise burning in his heart that would never, ever be extinguished. The question wasn't if he would return. The question was whether he would return in time. Princeton University was a different universe from Millbrook, and Caleb felt the difference in every fiber of his being from the moment he stepped onto campus. The Gothic architecture towered above him like cathedrals, the manicured lawns stretched endlessly in every direction, and students walked past wearing clothes that probably cost more than Vera's monthly rent. Caleb carried everything he owned in 2 second-hand suitcases held together with rope, and as he made his way to his assigned dormitory, he could feel the stares, could hear the whispered judgments. His roommate turned out to be Preston Whitfield III, a legacy student whose family had attended Princeton for 4 generations and whose father sat on the board of a Fortune 500 company. Preston took one look at Caleb's shabby luggage and worn-out sneakers and spent the next week asking the housing office for a room transfer. But Caleb didn't let it break him. He'd survived worse than snobbery. Every morning he woke at 5 a.m., the old bakery habits too ingrained to shake, and he studied while the rest of campus slept. He took the maximum course load allowed, adding extra credits whenever possible. Pre-med was brutal, the competition fierce, the workload crushing. Students around him crumbled under the pressure, switching majors or dropping out entirely, but Caleb pushed through every sleepless night, every impossible exam, every moment of doubt. He called Vera every Sunday without fail, standing in the hallway of his dorm with a phone cord he could barely afford, listening to her voice tell him about the bakery, about Millbrook, about the small-town gossip that suddenly seemed so far away. She never complained, never told him that business was slow or that her arthritis was getting worse or that the oven had broken down again and she'd spent 3 days fixing it herself with YouTube videos and prayer. She kept her struggles hidden because she knew Caleb would drop everything and come home, and she refused to be the reason his dreams died. During his sophomore year, Caleb met Professor Eleanor Ashford, a renowned biochemist who saw something special in this serious young man who sat in the front row of her organic chemistry class and asked questions that showed he wasn't just memorizing formulas but truly understanding the underlying principles. She offered him a position in her research lab, a coveted opportunity usually reserved for graduate students. Caleb worked in that lab every spare moment he had, running experiments, analyzing data, co-authoring papers that would eventually be published in prestigious scientific journals. The other students in the lab were brilliant, most of them from wealthy families with connections and opportunities Caleb could only dream about, but he outworked every single one of them. While they went to parties and networking events, Caleb was in the lab. While they took spring break trips to Europe, Caleb worked double shifts at the campus dining hall to send money back to Vera, even though she told him repeatedly not to. The watch she'd given him never left his wrist, and he touched it like a talisman whenever the pressure threatened to overwhelm him, reminding himself why he was here, what he'd promised, who was waiting for him to succeed. By junior year, Caleb had become something of a campus legend among the pre-med students. He had a perfect GPA, multiple research publications, and recommendations from professors who described him as the most dedicated student they'd encountered in decades of teaching. But success didn't make him popular. His intensity made other students uncomfortable, his work ethic made them feel inadequate, and his background made him an outsider no matter how brilliant he became. Preston Whitfield III, still his roommate despite years of passive-aggressive hostility, took particular pleasure in reminding Caleb of his place. During one memorable dinner at the prestigious Ivy Club, which Caleb had been invited to join by Professor Ashford, Preston stood up with a glass of expensive wine and made a toast that dripped with condescension. To Caleb Jensen, he announced loudly, who proves that even charity cases can make something of themselves if they work hard enough. How inspiring that someone from such humble beginnings can sit at the same table as the rest of us. The room fell silent, everyone waiting to see how Caleb would respond. He stood slowly, his face calm, and raised his own glass of water. To Preston Whitfield III, he said evenly, who proves that privilege and education can't buy character or kindness. I'd rather come from nothing and build something meaningful than inherit everything and contribute nothing. The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife, but several students started clapping, and Preston's face turned red with fury. From that moment on, Caleb had both fierce allies and dangerous enemies, but he didn't care about either. He had a goal, a promise, and nothing was going to distract him from it. Senior year brought the MCAT, the grueling medical school entrance exam that would determine his future. Caleb studied for 6 months straight, taking practice tests until he could recite questions in his sleep. When the results came back, he'd scored in the 99th percentile, high enough to get into any medical school in the country. The applications went out to Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Stanford, every top program, and the acceptance letters started rolling in one by one. But it was the letter from Harvard Medical School, accompanied by a full scholarship and a stipend for living expenses, that made Caleb call Vera with tears streaming down his face. "I did it," he told her, his voice breaking. "I actually did it." Vera was crying too, he could hear it over the phone. "I never doubted you for a second," she said. "Your parents would be so proud. I'm so proud." That summer before medical school, Caleb returned to Millbrook for the first time in 4 years. The town looked smaller than he remembered, shabbier, like he'd been seeing it through a child's eyes, and now reality had set in. He'd sent money to Vera every month during college, small amounts at first and then larger sums as he won academic prizes and research grants, but nothing prepared him for what he found when he walked into Coleman's bakery. The place was falling apart. The paint was peeling, the front window had a crack running through it, the display cases were half empty, and Vera herself looked years older than she should have. She'd lost weight, her hands shook slightly when she hugged him, and he noticed a medical bill partially hidden under the cash register with an amount that made his stomach drop. "What happened?" he demanded, anger and fear warring in his chest. "Why didn't you tell me?" Vera waved him off with a tired smile. "Just the usual struggles of running a small business. Nothing I can't handle. Tell me about Princeton, about medical school, about everything." But Caleb wasn't fooled. He spent the next 3 days investigating, talking to suppliers, reviewing the bakery's finances, and what he discovered made him furious. The town had changed in his absence. A big commercial bakery had opened 20 miles away, offering cheaper prices and longer hours. Most of Millbrook's residents had started shopping there, leaving Vera with only a handful of loyal customers. Her costs had gone up, her revenue had plummeted, and she'd been too proud to tell Caleb the truth. Worse, she'd been diagnosed with diabetes 2 years earlier, requiring expensive medication that her bare-bones insurance barely covered. She'd been choosing between buying medicine and buying flour, between treating her illness and keeping the bakery alive, and she'd chosen the bakery every single time. Caleb confronted her that night upstairs in the small apartment that still smelled like cinnamon and yeast. "You're killing yourself," he said, voice shaking with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ask for help?" Vera's eyes flashed with something fierce and proud. "Because you had your own life to build. Because I didn't save you all those years ago so you could spend the rest of your life saving me. Because some of us don't get happy endings, Caleb, and that's okay as long as we help someone else get theirs." "That's not how this works," Caleb said, grabbing her hands. "You don't get to sacrifice everything for me and then pretend it doesn't matter. I made you a promise, remember? When I'm rich, I'll pay you back." "Well, I'm not rich yet, but I will be, and when I am, I'm going to make sure you never worry about money again. You're going to close this bakery, sell this building, and move somewhere safe and comfortable where you can actually take care of yourself." But Vera pulled her hands away, shaking her head stubbornly. "This bakery is my life. This building holds every memory of Silas, every moment with you, everything that matters to me. I'm not giving it up. I'd rather die trying than live doing nothing." They argued for hours, neither one willing to back down, until finally Caleb realized he couldn't win this fight, not yet. So he made a different promise. "5 years," he said. "Give me 5 years to finish medical school and get established. Then I'm coming back here and I'm going to save you the way you saved me, whether you like it or not." "That's not a request, Vera. That's a fact." Vera smiled sadly and touched his cheek the way she used to when he was 13. You've got a stubborn streak a mile wide. I wonder where you got that from. Caleb returned to the East Coast with a new fire burning inside him. Medical school at Harvard was even more demanding than Princeton, the competition even more cutthroat, the stakes even higher. He watched classmates struggle with the workload, saw relationships crumble under the pressure, witnessed brilliant students burn out and quit. But Caleb thrived in the chaos. He spent 80-hour weeks in hospitals during his clinical rotations, volunteered for the most difficult cases, sought out the toughest attendings because he knew they'd teach him the most. He specialized in cardiothoracic surgery, one of the most challenging and demanding fields in medicine, because it offered the best financial prospects and the greatest opportunity to make a real difference. By his third year, he was already being courted by prestigious hospitals offering residency positions. His hands were steady, his mind was sharp, and his dedication was absolute. He performed his first solo surgery under supervision during his fourth year, a complex valve replacement that went flawlessly, and the attending surgeon told him he had the hands of a master and the instincts of someone who'd been operating for decades. But success came with a price. Caleb had no social life, no romantic relationships, no hobbies or interests beyond medicine. Other residents went to bars after shift, played sports on their days off, tried to maintain some semblance of normal life. Caleb used every free moment to study, to practice, to improve. The watch on his wrist was a constant reminder of why he couldn't slow down, couldn't relax, couldn't stop pushing himself beyond normal human limits. Every Sunday he called Vera, and every Sunday he heard her voice getting weaker, her breathing getting more labored, her lies about being fine getting less convincing. The bakery was dying, and so was she, and Caleb was powerless to stop it from hundreds of miles away. During his final year of medical school, he received an offer that would change everything. Dr. Raymond Mitchell, chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the best hospitals in the world, called Caleb into his office with an opportunity that seemed too good to be true. "I've been watching you," Dr. Mitchell said, his steely eyes assessing Caleb with the intensity of a man who made life-and-death decisions every day. "You're the best student I've seen in 20 years. I want you for my residency program, and after that, I want you as a partner in my private practice. We serve the wealthiest clients in Boston, perform surgeries that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and if you're as good as I think you are, you could be making 7 figures within 5 years of finishing residency." 7 figures. Enough money to save Vera, to rebuild the bakery, to give her the comfortable retirement she deserved. Enough money to finally keep his promise. Caleb accepted on the spot. The residency was hell. 5 years of 100-hour weeks, of sleeping in hospital on-call rooms, of holding human hearts in his hands while making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Caleb assisted on hundreds of surgeries, then performed dozens himself, building a reputation as one of the most talented young surgeons in the country. His success rate was exceptional, his technique was flawless, and his ability to stay calm under pressure was legendary. By his third year of residency, he was making more money than he'd ever imagined possible, and he sent most of it to Vera. But she refused to use it for herself. Instead, she used it to keep the bakery running, to pay off old debts, to help other struggling families in Millbrook the way she'd once helped Caleb. It was noble and infuriating in equal measure, and no matter how much Caleb argued with her, she wouldn't change. Then, during his 4th year of residency, the call came that Caleb had been dreading for 15 years. It was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, and he was scrubbing out after a 12-hour surgery when his phone rang with a Millbrook area code he didn't recognize. A woman's voice, shaking and apologetic, introduced herself as Iris Chin, the new doctor at Millbrook's small clinic. "I'm so sorry to call you like this," she said, "but Vera Coleman listed you as her emergency contact. She collapsed in her bakery this evening. We've stabilized her, but her heart is failing, Mr. Jensen. She needs a transplant and she needs it soon, or she's not going to make it." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Caleb's hands, so steady in the operating room, started shaking. "How long?" he managed to ask. "Weeks, maybe months if we're lucky. But there's another problem. She has no insurance that would cover a transplant, and the cost would be astronomical. Even if we could find her a donor, she'd never be able to afford the surgery or the anti-rejection medications she'd need for the rest of her life." Caleb closed his eyes, and in that moment, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every promise he'd ever made crystallized into absolute clarity. "Transfer her to Mass General," he said, his voice hard as steel. "I'll handle everything. The surgery, the costs, all of it. Just keep her alive until I get there." He hung up and immediately called Dr. Mitchell, waking him despite the hour. "I need a favor," Caleb said without preamble. The woman who raised me is dying. She needs a heart transplant. I need you to help me save her life. There was a pause, then Dr. Mitchell's gruff voice came back. Bring her here. We'll put her on the transplant list and I'll make sure she gets priority. But Caleb, you need to understand, even with priority status, hearts don't grow on trees. We might not find a match in time. Then we'll find a way to buy her time, Caleb said. Whatever it takes. She saved my life when I was 13 years old. Now it's my turn to save hers. He drove to Millbrook that night, making the 6-hour journey in 4.5, his foot heavy on the gas pedal and his mind racing with medical options and financial calculations. The small-town clinic looked even more run down than he remembered, and when he walked into Vera's room, his heart nearly broke. She looked so small in the hospital bed, hooked up to machines that beeped and whirred, her face pale and her breathing shallow. But when she saw him, her eyes lit up with that familiar warmth, and she managed a weak smile. You didn't have to come all this way, she whispered. I'm fine. You're dying, Caleb said bluntly, pulling a chair close to her bed and taking her hand. And you're not fine. But you will be, because I'm going to fix this. I made you a promise 20 years ago and I'm keeping it right now. Tears slipped down Vera's cheeks. You already kept your promise, Caleb. You became someone amazing. You don't owe me anything more. Yes, I do, Caleb said fiercely. I owe you everything. And you're going to let me help you this time, no arguments. We're transferring you to Boston tomorrow, putting you on the transplant list, and you're going to fight to stay alive until we find you a heart. Do you understand me? Vera tried to argue, tried to protest the cost and the inconvenience, but Caleb shut down every objection with facts and determination. For the first time in their relationship, he was the one taking care of her, and he wasn't taking no for an answer. The transfer happened the next day, and Vera was installed in a private room at Mass General with round-the-clock care. Caleb pulled every string he had, called in every favor, and used his position at the hospital to ensure she received the absolute best treatment available. He arranged for her to see the top cardiologists, got her on experimental medications that might buy her more time, and personally oversaw every aspect of her care. But finding a heart was the problem. Days turned into weeks, and Vera's condition slowly deteriorated despite everyone's best efforts. She was too weak for a mechanical heart, too old to be high priority on the transplant list, and her rare blood type made finding a match even harder. Caleb spent every free moment either by her bedside or researching alternatives, pushing himself so hard that Dr. Mitchell eventually pulled him aside. You can't save everyone, Dr. Mitchell said quietly. Sometimes, no matter how skilled we are or how hard we try, we lose patience. You need to prepare yourself for that possibility. But Caleb shook his head. Not her. Anyone but her. I'll find a way. Then, on a cold December night exactly 3 weeks after Vera's transfer, a miracle happened, though it came wrapped in tragedy. A young woman named Celine Morris, 24 years old and healthy, was killed in a car accident 2 states away, and she was an organ donor with Vera's exact blood type and tissue match. The call came at midnight, and Caleb was in the operating room within 30 minutes, part of the surgical team that would transplant Celine's heart into Vera's failing chest. It was the longest and most terrifying surgery of Caleb's life, even though he performed the same procedure dozens of times for other patients. His hands didn't shake, his focus never wavered, but inside he was screaming with fear that something would go wrong, that he'd lose the woman who'd saved him all those years ago. But the surgery was flawless. The new heart started beating in Vera's chest with strong, steady rhythm, and when she woke up 18 hours later, weak but alive, Caleb sat beside her bed and cried like he hadn't cried since his parents died. Welcome back, he whispered, holding her hand. You scared me. Vera smiled, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube. Told you I'd be fine. The recovery was long and difficult, but Vera fought through every complication and setback with the same stubborn determination she'd shown running the bakery all those years. 3 months later, she was strong enough to leave the hospital, and Caleb had a surprise waiting for her. He'd bought a beautiful house in a quiet Boston suburb, close enough to Mass General for her regular checkups but far enough from the city for peace and quiet. It had a garden where she could grow herbs and vegetables, a modern kitchen she could bake in if she wanted, and a room already set up with everything she'd need for her recovery. This is too much, Vera protested when Caleb showed her the house. You've already spent a fortune on my surgery and care. I can't accept this too. Yes, you can, Caleb said firmly. Because this is what I promised you 20 years ago. I told you I'd pay you back when I was rich, and now I am, and this is me keeping that promise. You spent years taking care of me. Now it's your turn to be taken care of. But even as Vera settled into her new life, even as she grew stronger and healthier, Caleb knew something was missing. She was alive and comfortable, but she wasn't truly happy. She missed Millbrook, missed the bakery, missed the purpose that had driven her for decades. And Caleb realized that saving her life wasn't enough. He needed to give her back her reason for living, but in a way that wouldn't destroy her health again. The idea came to him during a surgery 6 months after Vera's transplant, and it was so perfect he almost laughed out loud in the operating room. He would go back to Millbrook not as a visitor but as a permanent resident, bringing world-class medical care to the small town that had once been his home. He would open a clinic that would serve everyone regardless of their ability to pay, and he would rebuild Coleman's Bakery not as a struggling business but as a community center where Vera could teach baking classes and serve as a mentor to young people the way she'd mentored him. It would cost millions, require leaving his prestigious position at Mass General, and mean walking away from the wealth and status he'd worked so hard to achieve. But as Caleb touched the watch on his wrist, the one Vera had given him with the inscription about promises lasting forever, he knew it was exactly what he needed to do. The only question was whether Vera would agree to come back to Millbrook with him, and whether the town that had once judged her so harshly would be ready to witness what happened when a promise made by a desperate boy became the mission of a powerful man determined to change an entire community. The day Caleb drove back into Millbrook with Vera sitting beside him in his car, the entire town seemed to hold its breath, because news had already spread through the gossip chains that the orphan boy who'd left 20 years ago was returning as Dr. Caleb Jensen, one of the most successful cardiothoracic surgeons on the East Coast, and he was bringing plans that would shake their small community to its core. The old Coleman's Bakery building stood exactly where it had always been, but now it wore a massive sign that read "Closed or reopening soon under new vision," and behind those dusty windows, construction crews were already at work, tearing down walls and rebuilding the interior according to blueprints that Caleb had spent months perfecting with architects and designers who specialized in community spaces. Vera sat in the passenger seat with tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed against the window as she stared at her old building being transformed, and Caleb reached over to squeeze her other hand, reminding her that sometimes things had to be broken down completely before they could be rebuilt into something even better. The town council had called an emergency meeting when they'd heard about Caleb's plans, with Mayor Fisher, Garrett's father, leading the charge of opposition, standing in the cramped municipal building with his face red and his voice booming as he declared that Millbrook didn't need some big city doctor coming back and changing everything they'd built, that their small-town values were perfectly fine without interference from someone who'd abandoned them for fancy schools and prestigious hospitals. But Caleb had anticipated the resistance, and he showed up to that meeting in a simple button-down shirt and jeans, carrying a presentation folder thick with plans and financial projections. And when he stood to speak, the room fell silent because there was something about this man, this poor orphan boy who'd transformed himself into someone extraordinary, that commanded respect even from his harshest critics. He explained his vision with clarity and passion, describing a medical clinic that would provide free or low-cost healthcare to anyone who needed it, funded entirely by his own money and donations he'd already secured from wealthy colleagues in Boston who believed in the mission. A clinic that would serve not just Millbrook but all the surrounding rural communities where people currently had to drive 2 hours to see a doctor or went without care entirely because they couldn't afford it. He talked about rebuilding the bakery into a community center where Vera would teach baking classes to young people, where job skills training would be offered, where families could gather for events and support groups, where the heart of Millbrook could beat strong again after years of economic decline and population loss. He showed them the numbers, the projected economic impact, the jobs that would be created, the lives that would be saved, and he made it clear that he wasn't asking for their permission because he'd already bought the buildings and secured the permits, but he was asking for their partnership because this would only work if the community embraced it and made it their own. The silence that followed his presentation was deafening, broken finally by Dorothy Hughes, the pharmacist's wife who'd once called Vera crazy for taking in a homeless boy, standing up with tears in her eyes as she said she'd been wrong all those years ago, that she judged both Vera and Caleb unfairly, and that if this was his way of giving back to the town that had failed him, then she would support him in any way she could. One by one, others stood to voice their support, sharing stories of medical hardships and financial struggles, of children who'd moved away because there were no opportunities in Millbrook, of elderly parents who couldn't get proper health care, and by the end of the meeting even Mayor Fisher had to grudgingly admit that maybe, just maybe, this was exactly what their dying town needed to survive. The construction took 6 months, and during that time Caleb worked alongside the crews every moment he wasn't interviewing staff for the clinic or finalizing partnerships with medical supply companies and pharmaceutical manufacturers who agreed to provide medications at cost. Vera spent her days planning the community center programs, reaching out to local teachers and volunteers, designing baking classes that would start with basic bread making and progress to advanced pastry techniques, creating a mentorship program that would pair struggling students with successful adults who could guide them toward better futures. The whole town watched the transformation with a mixture of awe and disbelief, seeing their shabby main street slowly come back to life as other business owners, inspired by Caleb's investment, started renovating their own buildings and extending their hours, betting that the influx of people coming for medical care and community programs would bring new customers and renewed prosperity. Then came the twist that no one, not even Caleb, had anticipated. 3 weeks before the grand opening, Garrett Fisher showed up at the construction site looking nothing like the arrogant bully who tormented Caleb through school, his expensive suit rumpled and his eyes hollow with something that looked like desperation mixed with shame. He asked to speak with Caleb privately, and they stood in what would soon be the clinic's waiting room, surrounded by the smell of fresh paint and new beginnings, as Garrett's story poured out in broken sentences and painful admissions. His father, the mayor, had been diagnosed with advanced lung cancer 6 months ago, had been driving 3 hours each way for chemotherapy treatments that were bankrupting the family despite their wealth, and the cancer was winning because the treatments were too far apart and the local hospital didn't have the facilities or specialists needed for aggressive intervention. Garrett's voice cracked as he explained that his father was too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to admit that the town's lack of medical infrastructure was literally killing him, and Garrett himself had spent years working in finance in Chicago but had come home to watch his father die because that's what sons did, even for fathers who taught them to be cruel and judgmental. He looked at Caleb with eyes that held genuine remorse and said he knew he had no right to ask for anything, that he'd made Caleb's life hell for years, that he'd been a terrible person who'd inherited his father's worst traits, but he was begging now, actually begging, for Caleb to consider treating his father when the clinic opened, to give the man who'd done nothing but oppose this project a chance to survive. Caleb stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of old anger and new power, remembering every cruel word Garrett had spoken, every shove in the hallway, every humiliation inflicted for no reason other than Caleb's poverty and orphan status, and he could have said no, could have let karma run its course, could have turned away the way the town had once turned away from a starving 13-year-old boy. But then he thought about Vera, about the lesson she'd taught him when she opened her door on that rainy night, about how kindness doesn't keep score and compassion doesn't demand worthiness, and he heard himself saying yes before his rational mind could object, explaining that his clinic would serve everyone regardless of their past or their politics, that healing wasn't something you earned but something you received because you were human and humans deserved care. Garrett's face crumpled with relief and gratitude, and he did something Caleb never expected. He got down on his knees right there among the sawdust and paint cans and apologized, really apologized for every cruel thing he'd ever done, for every moment of pain he'd caused, for being the kind of person who measured worth by wealth and status instead of character and kindness. Caleb pulled him to his feet, uncomfortable with the display but understanding it, and told him that the past was the past but the future was unwritten, and if Garrett wanted to make amends he could start by helping with the community center programs, by using his finance skills to help struggling families manage their budgets, by becoming part of the solution instead of part of the problem. The grand opening of the Jensen Medical Clinic and the Coleman Community Center happened on a brilliant Saturday morning in June, with the entire town turning out and news crews from 3 different cities filming the event because somehow the story of the orphan boy who'd become a doctor and returned to save his dying town had captured imaginations far beyond Millbrook's borders. The buildings gleamed in the sunshine, the clinic with its state-of-the-art examination rooms and diagnostic equipment that rivaled anything in Boston, the community center with its industrial kitchens and classrooms and gathering spaces that smelled of fresh bread and new possibilities. Vera stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony wearing a beautiful dress that Caleb had bought her, her cheeks pink with health and happiness, and when the mayor handed her the scissors to cut the ribbon, she looked at Caleb with such pure love and pride that half the audience started crying. The speeches were kept short because Caleb had never been one for long-winded celebrations, but when it was his turn to speak, he stood before the crowd with the watch Vera had given him visible on his wrist and told the story that most of them already knew but needed to hear again, about a desperate boy making a promise to a kind woman, about 20 years of struggle and sacrifice and determination, about keeping promises even when it seemed impossible, about how one person's compassion could ripple outward and change an entire community if given the chance to grow. He thanked Vera publicly for saving his life, for teaching him that worth wasn't measured in money but in how you treated people when they had nothing to offer you in return, and he announced that the clinic and community center would be funded in perpetuity by the Vera Coleman Foundation, an endowment he'd established with $10 million of his own money, ensuring that even after he was gone, the work would continue and the promise would never be broken. The crowd erupted in applause and Vera tried to protest the honor, but Caleb just hugged her and whispered that this was only the beginning, that they had so much more to build together. The first patient at the clinic was Mayor Fisher, brought in by his son Garrett just hours after the opening ceremony, and Caleb examined him personally, reviewing scans and test results before explaining that the cancer was advanced but not hopeless, that there were new treatments they could try, that he would coordinate with oncologists in Boston to create an aggressive treatment plan that could be administered right here in Millbrook. The mayor, humbled by illness and confronted by the generosity of the man he'd opposed, broke down in tears and apologized not just to Caleb but to Vera, admitting that he'd been wrong about everything, that he'd let prejudice and pride blind him to the goodness right in front of him, that if he survived this cancer he would spend whatever time he had left making amends. Over the following months, the clinic treated hundreds of patients, from children with ear infections to elderly farmers with heart disease, from pregnant mothers who'd never had prenatal care to diabetics who'd been rationing insulin because they couldn't afford proper treatment. Caleb hired 3 other doctors and a full nursing staff, creating jobs and bringing young professionals back to Millbrook, and the economic impact rippled through the town like stones dropped in a pond, with new restaurants opening to serve the increased traffic, the old hotel being renovated because people needed places to stay while their relatives received treatment, the school enrollment increasing as families moved back because suddenly Millbrook was a place with a future instead of just a past. The community center became the heart of town life, with Vera teaching baking classes that filled up months in advance, her students ranging from curious teenagers to retired seniors who'd always wanted to learn, and the bread and pastries they produced were sold at a farmer's market that sprang up every Saturday, with proceeds going to fund scholarships for students who wanted to pursue education beyond high school. Garrett Fisher became one of Vera's most dedicated volunteers, showing up early every morning to help set up classes and staying late to clean up, and slowly, painfully, he transformed from the bully he'd been into someone who actually contributed something positive to the world, proving that people could change if given the chance and the motivation. 1 year after the opening, on another sunny June morning, Caleb stood in the clinic's parking lot watching a scene that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Vera was leading a group of students in a bread baking demonstration, her laughter carrying across the square, while inside the clinic a team of doctors he'd trained were seeing patients who would have gone without care in the old Millbrook. Mayor Fisher, in remission from his cancer, was working with the town council to attract more businesses and infrastructure improvements, using Caleb's success as a model for what was possible when people chose compassion over judgment. The bakery building that had once been Vera's lonely struggle now served dozens of people every day, and the promise that a desperate 13-year-old boy had made to a kind woman had transformed into something bigger than either of them could have imagined, a legacy of care and community that would outlive them both. Caleb touched the watch on his wrist, the inscription about promises lasting forever still clearly visible despite years of wear, and he thought about his parents who died too young, about the hunger and fear and loneliness of those early days, about every moment of struggle and doubt and grinding work that had led him to this moment. A car pulled up, and a woman got out holding a small child's hand, looking nervous and uncertain, and Caleb recognized the expression because he'd worn it himself once, the look of someone who needed help but wasn't sure they deserved it. He walked over with a warm smile and said the same words that had changed his life 20 years ago, "Come in, we're here to help," and the woman's face flooded with relief as she followed him into the clinic, just another person whose life was about to change because someone chose kindness over indifference. That evening, Caleb had dinner with Vera in her house, the one he'd bought for her recovery, and as they sat across from each other eating the meal she'd cooked, she reached across the table and took his hand. "You know," she said softly, "when I opened that door all those years ago and saw a skinny, scared boy standing in the rain, I never imagined any of this. I just saw someone who needed help and I helped him. That's all." Caleb squeezed her hand, his throat tight with emotion. "That's not all. You saw someone worth saving when the whole world had decided I wasn't. You gave me food and shelter, but more than that, you gave me dignity and hope and a reason to believe that goodness still existed. Every life I save, every person I help, every promise I keep, it all started with you opening that door. So no, it wasn't just helping. It was everything." Vera's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I got the better end of this deal, you know. I got a son when I thought I'd always be alone. I got to watch you grow into someone extraordinary. I got to see that kindness actually does matter, that it actually does come back. Not everyone gets that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two people bound by love and promises and the kind of family that wasn't made by blood but by choice, by sacrifice, by showing up when it mattered most. Outside, Millbrook settled into evening, lights coming on in houses and businesses, children playing in yards, neighbors talking on porches, a small town that had been dying slowly but was now coming back to life, all because a poor boy had made a promise and a rich man had kept it. The story could have ended there with everything wrapped up neatly and all promises fulfilled, but life isn't really about endings, it's about cycles and ripples and the way one act of kindness creates another in an endless chain. 6 months later, a teenage girl showed up at the clinic hungry and scared and pregnant, with nowhere to go and no one to help her, and when Caleb saw her in the waiting room looking exactly like he must have looked standing outside that bakery so many years ago, he knew exactly what to do. He called Vera, who came immediately, and together they sat with this girl and told her that she wasn't alone, that they would help her, that her story didn't have to end in despair but could transform into something beautiful if she was willing to fight for it. The girl's name was Noelle, and she became the first resident of a program Vera established at the community center, a home for young mothers who needed support and training and a safe place to raise their children. And watching Vera work with Noelle the same way she'd once worked with him, Caleb understood that this was how promises really worked, not as transactions that ended when debts were paid, but as ongoing commitments that created new promises, new possibilities, new chances for redemption and transformation. 3 years after returning to Millbrook, Caleb stood before another crowd at another ceremony, this time to announce the expansion of the clinic into a full hospital with an emergency room and surgical facilities, funded by donations that had poured in from around the country as the story of Millbrook's transformation spread. And as he spoke about dreams and promises and the power of choosing kindness, he looked out at the audience and saw Garrett Fisher sitting with his father who was still in remission, saw Noelle holding her healthy baby daughter, saw dozens of patients whose lives had been saved or improved, saw a community that had learned to value people over profit and compassion over judgment, and he knew that the promise he'd made as a desperate 13-year-old boy had been kept in ways he never could have imagined. That night, back at Vera's house, she gave him a gift wrapped in the same newspaper she'd used for the watch 20 years earlier, and inside was a journal, leather-bound and beautiful, with a note on the first page in Vera's careful handwriting. "Write down the promises people make to you," it said, "and help them keep those promises the way I helped you keep yours. Because that's what we do now. We give people reasons to hope and tools to succeed and second chances when the world says they don't deserve them. That's our promise to the world, and it's one we'll keep together for as long as we both shall live." Caleb read those words through tears, understanding that Vera had given him more than shelter and food all those years ago. She'd given him a blueprint for living, a purpose that would carry him through whatever came next, and he added his own note below hers. "I promise to never forget where I came from, to never stop fighting for people who have nothing, to never turn away from someone who needs help, and to teach others to do the same. This promise will outlive us both, passed down through every person we help, every life we touch, every moment we choose kindness over convenience. This is the promise that matters most, and it's one I'll keep until my last breath." Years would pass, and that hospital would grow into a regional medical center, and the community programs would expand to serve 6 counties, and Millbrook would transform from a dying small town into a model for rural revitalization that other communities would study and emulate, but the core truth would remain the same. One person's kindness had saved a boy's life, and that boy had grown into a man who saved an entire town, and that town had learned to save itself by remembering that people mattered more than anything else, that promises were sacred, that the measure of a community wasn't its wealth but its willingness to care for its most vulnerable members. And when Caleb was old, sitting on Vera's porch in the house he'd bought her, watching the sunset paint Millbrook in shades of gold and remembering everything they'd built together, he would touch that watch on his wrist one more time and think about the scared, hungry boy who'd knocked on a bakery door with nothing but hope and desperation, and he would whisper the same promise he'd made so many years ago, "I'll pay you back when I'm rich," knowing that he'd kept that promise 1,000 times over, not just with money but with love, with dedication, with a lifetime spent honoring the woman who'd saved him and the values she'd taught him, and that promise would echo forward through all the lives they'd touched, through all the people they'd helped, through all the kindness they'd spread, rippling outward in endless waves that would touch shores they'd never see, helping people they'd never meet, proving that a promise made by a poor boy to a kind woman could literally change the world if it was kept with enough dedication and love and stubborn, beautiful determination to make good things happen no matter what stood in the way. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to this channel to support our growth and help us bring more powerful, life-changing stories like this to the world. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that kindness matters, that promises are sacred, and that one person's compassion can create ripples that transform entire communities. Drop a comment below telling us what promises you've made and how you plan to keep them, because your story matters too, and together we can build a world where everyone remembers to help the person standing in the rain, hungry and scared and desperate for someone to care. Thank you for watching, and remember, the best promise you can make is to never stop being kind.